You are already 35 and still single. Must be tough spending every Christmas alone. My sister Kiara sneered. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a specific cutting frequency designed to carry effortlessly over the clinking of heavy Baccarat crystal and the soft, rhythmic hum of holiday jazz playing from the hidden surround sound speakers. Laughter erupted immediately around the expansive mahogany dining table, the sound echoing off the towering vaulted ceilings of my mother's Buckhead estate. The laughter was not warm. It was sharp, synchronized, and entirely at my expense. It was the kind of laughter that had defined my entire existence within this family. A chorus of mockery, designed to keep me small, so that they could feel impossibly large. My mother, Beatrice, sat at the opposite end of the table, draped in a custom emerald green silk dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She gently dabbed the corners of her mouth with a meticulously ironed linen napkin, careful not to smudge her perfectly applied dark red lipstick. She waved a dismissive, heavily jeweled hand in the air, the diamonds on her fingers catching the light of the massive chandelier overhead. "Oh, leave her be. She is just joking, Sienna," Beatrice murmured, her tone dripping with that familiar condescending pity she reserved exclusively for me. "We all know how much you focus on your little job. Not everyone is meant for the complexities of a real marriage." I did not immediately respond. Instead, I set my crystal champagne flute down on the pristine white tablecloth. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely stripped of the anxiety they were so desperately hoping to provoke. I looked past the towering centerpiece of imported winter roses and stared directly into my sister's face. Kiara wore a smug, victorious little smile, her posture radiating the unearned arrogance of a woman who had never worked a day in her life. She fully expected me to lower my head in shame, to absorb the insult just as I had done when we were children. "Do not worry about me," I said calmly. My voice was steady, cutting through the dying laughter like a perfectly sharpened blade. "I have been married for a long time." My mother froze mid-toast. Her champagne glass hovered just inches from her lips, her fingers suddenly rigid. The entire dining room plunged into a suffocating, breathless silence. The only sound left in the cavernous space was the faint crackle of the massive stone fireplace and the distant muted trumpet of a John Coltrane record. That was the exact moment the fragile, painstakingly curated illusion of our perfect Atlanta family began to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I am Sienna. I am 35 years old, and for the last decade, I have been the designated disappointment of a family that values superficial perception over actual reality. I run a highly successful, aggressively ruthless corporate crisis management firm. It is a demanding, high-stakes career where I regularly navigate hostile corporate takeovers, federal audits, and international public relations disasters. Yet, it is a career that my mother actively and continuously diminishes, simply because it does not come with a country club membership, a spot on a charity board, or a wealthy husband she can parade in front of her judgmental friends. To Beatrice, a woman's worth is entirely dependent on the financial status of the man standing next to her in the country club photographs. Tonight was supposed to be a simple, obligatory Christmas dinner. I had promised myself before I walked through those heavy double doors that I would eat my catered food, endure the passive-aggressive remarks about my hair and my wardrobe, and leave early to enjoy the peace of my own home. But the toxicity in this house had recently mutated into something entirely unendurable, driven largely by the massive overbearing presence of the man sitting at the head of the table. Trent Kiara's white husband shifted in his seat, the antique leather chair groaning under his weight. Trent was the golden son-in-law, the ultimate shining prize my mother had prayed for since Kiara was a teenager. He was a tech entrepreneur who spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords, always loudly discussing synergistic paradigm shifts, hyper-scalable architectures, and disruptive monetization. He carried an air of unearned, staggering arrogance that suffocated everyone around him. Tonight, he was particularly insufferable because his software startup was allegedly weeks away from a $50 million acquisition by Vanguard Holdings, one of the most ruthless, heavily capitalized, and powerful venture capital firms in the world. For the past 2 hours, Trent had entirely dominated the conversation. He had bragged endlessly about his impending wealth, the yacht he planned to charter in Monaco, and the custom Ferrari he was already configuring online. Meanwhile, my mother and sister hung on to his every single word like it was gospel, treating him as though he were the second coming of business royalty. $50 million. Beatrice had sighed earlier in the evening, her eyes sparkling with unadulterated greed. Trent, you are truly elevating this family to the next level. Kiara is so incredibly blessed to have a man who knows how to provide. Not everyone has that kind of brilliant business acumen or the ability to secure a legacy. She had shot a pointed, vicious glance in my direction when she said it. I had ignored the bait, then choosing to chew my roasted asparagus in silence. But my sudden flat revelation of a secret marriage had just thrown a massive wrench into their carefully orchestrated narrative of my pathetic, lonely existence. Kiara blinked rapidly, her smug smile faltering and twisting into a look of genuine confusion and anger. Married you. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that sounded more like a bark. Are you absolutely delusional? You have not brought a man around to this house in 5 years. You live in some cramped rental apartment downtown. Do not sit here at this table and lie to us just because you are deeply jealous of Trent's success. I have absolutely no reason to be jealous of a man who builds houses out of cards, I replied, keeping my tone completely flat, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. And I am not lying. I am married. I just prefer to keep my private life entirely away from people who thrive on trying to destroy it. Trent scoffed loudly, leaning back heavily in his chair and swirling the expensive 20-year-old bourbon my mother had opened specifically and exclusively for him. Oh, this is rich. He chuckled, his face flushing red with alcohol and amusement. This is really rich. So who is this mysterious husband, Sienna? Let me guess. He is a delivery driver. Or maybe he works the late shift at a fast food joint and you are just too embarrassed to bring him to a real dinner with successful people. Is that why you keep him hidden away like a dirty little secret? Because he is a broke loser who cannot even afford to buy you a real diamond ring. You know, if he needs a job, I might have an opening in the mailroom of my new corporate headquarters once Vanguard clears the check. Trent, stop it, Beatrice scolded lightly, though the wide, highly entertained grin on her face completely betrayed her dark amusement. She turned her attention back to me, her expression instantly hardening into a familiar, chilling glare of deep disapproval. The matriarch of the family could not allow anyone to steal the spotlight from her golden son-in-law. She slammed her palm flat against the mahogany table, the sudden force rattling the expensive silverware and causing Kiara to jump slightly in her seat. Sienna, this is exactly why nobody enjoys your company. Beatrice hissed, her voice venomous and absolute. You always have to make up these pathetic, elaborate lies to draw attention to yourself. You cannot stand it when someone else is succeeding. Your sister's husband has worked tirelessly, and he is about to close a $50 million deal with Vanguard Holdings. This is their night to celebrate their hard work. For once in your miserable, lonely life, can you stop being so incredibly bitter and just be happy that someone in this family is actually succeeding? She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, issuing a command she fully expected me to obey without hesitation. You will apologize to Trent right now for trying to ruin the celebratory mood with your psychotic fabrications, and then you will sit quietly until dinner is over. I looked at Beatrice, feeling a cold, profound detachment slowly replace the familiar childhood ache of maternal rejection. For years, I had desperately craved her approval. I had quietly paid off her secret credit card debts when she overspent on designer bags to impress her friends. I had handled her messy legal disputes with contractors to protect her public image. I had kept my head down, swallowing my pride and my hurt, while she paraded Kiara around Buckhead as the flawless, perfect daughter. But sitting here tonight, listening to her blindly demand that I apologize to a man who was actively draining our generational wealth to fund a fraudulent tech company, I realized with absolute crystal clarity that I owed them nothing. I owed them no loyalty. I owed them no money. And I certainly owed them no apologies. The invisible chains of filial obligation that had bound me to this dining room table for 35 years simply dissolved into thin air. I did not argue. I did not yell. I did not offer the tearful defensive explanation they were so desperately hoping to extract from me so they could dissect and mock it further. Instead, I calmly pushed my heavy oak chair back and stood up to my full height. I smoothed the front of my tailored silk trousers, refusing to break eye contact with my mother. I reached for my camel-colored cashmere coat draped over the back of my chair and slipped it onto my shoulders, my movements unhurried, graceful, and completely composed. "I am not apologizing to anyone," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that finally wiped the triumphant smirk off Kiara's face. I reached deeply into my designer handbag. My fingers brushed past my leather wallet, and my car keys wrapping tightly around the cold, brushed aluminum of a small, silver USB drive. I pulled it out, holding it up for a fraction of a second, so its metallic surface caught the warm light of the crystal chandelier above us. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the massive table, my footsteps silent on the Persian rug, until I was standing directly beside Trent's chair. He looked up at me, his arrogant smile faltering slightly at the sheer, unyielding intensity radiating from my posture. He thought I was a beaten dog. He had no idea he was looking at a predator. I held my hand out directly over his plate and casually opened my fingers. The silver USB drive dropped through the air and landed perfectly in the center of Trent's half-eaten dinner. Clink. The sharp metallic sound of the heavy drive hitting the fine bone china echoed loudly in the dead silent dining room. It was a tiny, unassuming object, but it carried the devastating weight of absolute, undeniable destruction. It was the culmination of 6 months of forensic accounting, encrypted data extraction, and relentless investigation by my firm. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face just inches from Trent's ear, ensuring every single person at the table could hear the lethal precision of my final warning. "I hope you scrubbed your third quarter financial reports, Trent." I said, my tone completely devoid of mercy, sounding more like an executioner reading a sentence than a sister-in-law making a threat. Vanguard's forensic auditing team does not take kindly to ghost metrics, artificially inflated user engagement logs, or illegal offshore shell accounts hidden in the Cayman Islands. Trent's laughter died instantly in his throat. The confident, arrogant tech executive was completely gone, eradicated in a microsecond by a man who looked like he had just been caught standing over a dead body. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His eyes darted from the silver flash drive sitting in his gravy to my face, wide with a sudden frantic and unadulterated terror. He tried to open his mouth to speak, to offer some quick, buzzing tech rebuttal, but his vocal cords completely failed him. I did not wait for his response. I did not wait for Beatrice to start screaming again, nor did I wait for Kiara to process what I had just said. I turned on my heel, the sharp click of my stilettos striking the imported marble floors with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I walked straight out of the grand dining room, through the towering, decorated foyer, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors, stepping out into the freezing Atlanta night without ever looking back. The crisp, biting winter air of Atlanta hit my face the moment I stepped outside, providing an instant, refreshing contrast to the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the estate. The heavy mahogany front doors clicked shut behind me, sealing away the clinking crystal, the holiday jazz, and the overwhelming stench of manufactured superiority. The sprawling circular driveway was lined with an obnoxious fleet of luxury vehicles, a physical, gleaming manifestation of my mother's obsession with projecting immense wealth. I walked past Trent's newly leased bright red sports car. It was a ridiculous, ostentatious vehicle financed entirely by the very lies that were currently unraveling inside the house. The engine block was probably still warm, blissfully unaware that its owner was about to default on the exorbitant monthly payments. My heels crunched softly and rhythmically against the pristine gravel as I reached my own car, a sleek, understated black sedan that I actually owned free and clear. I slid behind the leather steering wheel, pulling the heavy door shut. The profound silence of the vehicle's insulated interior was deeply comforting. I placed my hands on the cold steering wheel, taking a long, slow breath, letting a hard-earned sense of liberation wash over my tired soul. Just as I reached out to press the ignition button, a frantic, guttural shout pierced through the thick, insulated walls of the mansion. I paused, keeping the engine off, and rolled my tinted window down just a few inches. The freezing wind whipped through the crack, carrying with it a sound that was unmistakable, raw, and desperate. It was the sound of a man watching his entire universe violently collapse inward. Through the brightly lit massive bay windows of the dining room, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the exact chaos I had just engineered. It was like watching a silent film of a spectacular train wreck. Trent was standing up abruptly, moving with such frantic, uncoordinated panic that he knocked his heavy antique dining chair backward. It crashed onto the hardwood floor, but he didn't seem to notice or care. He had his smartphone pressed so tightly against his ear that his knuckles were stark white, his free hand gripping a fistful of his own hair in sheer, unadulterated terror. The smug, condescending tech bro, who had spent the last 2 hours mocking my existence, confidently dictating the future of our family's finances, was entirely gone. His broad shoulders slumped heavily, his chest heaving as he paced erratically back and forth in front of the table, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. I did not need to hear the audio to know exactly what his panicked corporate lawyer was desperately trying to explain to him on a Christmas evening. Vanguard Holdings had just officially pulled the plug. The $50 million acquisition was completely dead in the water. Vanguard's elite legal team had just issued a formal binding suspension of the merger, pending a comprehensive forensic investigation into massive systemic financial fraud. Trent had actually thought he was clever. Like so many arrogant Silicon Valley wannabes, he thought he could infinitely inflate his active user base using cheap bot farms and fake duplicated accounts. He had aggressively padded his revenue projections to secure a massive buyout before his initial seed money ran out completely. He assumed Vanguard would simply push the paperwork through without looking closely under the hood, blinded by the hype of a trending software sector. He had absolutely no idea that Vanguard routinely employed independent crisis management firms to conduct aggressive shadow background audits before signing any major checks. And he certainly had no idea that I was the one who had meticulously compiled the dossier currently sitting on the desk of Vanguard's chief executive officer. Through the frosted glass of the bay windows, I watched Trent's knees physically buckle. He leaned his entire body weight against the edge of the dining table, nearly knocking over the expensive crystal glasses and the imported floral centerpiece my mother cherished so deeply. Kiara leaped out of her seat, her face twisted in a mask of confusion and mounting horror. She rushed to her husband's side, her emerald silk dress tangling around her legs. I could see her mouth moving rapidly, demanding to know what was happening, asking who was on the phone and why he looked like he was about to pass out. Trent slowly pulled the phone away from his ear. He looked at his wife with eyes wide with absolute inescapable terror. He said something to her, a brief, devastating sentence that carried the unbearable weight of impending bankruptcy and potential federal wire fraud charges. Kiara's reaction was instantaneous and hysterical. She let out a piercing, high-pitched scream, a shrill sound of pure, unadulterated panic that vibrated through the expensive glass windows and reached me all the way out in the driveway. She grabbed Trent by the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, shaking him violently, demanding him to fix it, screaming at him to tell her it was a prank. The golden child who had spent her entire life believing she was entitled to effortless, uninterrupted luxury suddenly realized her winning lottery ticket was printed on counterfeit paper. Beatrice stood frozen at the head of the table, her hands clutching her chest as she watched her prized son-in-law crumble before her eyes. The $50 million deal that anchored her entire social identity was vanishing into thin air. I smiled. It was a cold, quiet smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I pressed the ignition button, the powerful engine of my car, roaring to life with a steady, reliable hum that completely drowned out the muffled sounds of Kiara's continuing hysteria. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. I drove down the long, winding driveway, watching the brightly lit mansion shrink in my rearview mirror. Let them panic. Let them scramble to save a sinking ship. The first domino had officially fallen, and the devastation was only just beginning. Exactly 3 days passed in a state of absolute uninterrupted tranquility. I spent my mornings exactly as I preferred, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse, sipping a freshly brewed single-origin espresso and watching the sprawling Atlanta skyline awaken under a cold winter sun. According to my firm's internal digital monitors, the fallout from the Vanguard suspension had been swift and merciless. Trent's startup was currently hemorrhaging its initial seed investors faster than his frantic legal team could draft non-disclosure agreements. I had naturally assumed my family would be far too busy managing their own catastrophic financial meltdown to bother with me. I had severely underestimated their sheer unyielding audacity. The heavy soundproofed oak door to my private residence shuddered suddenly against a frantic, aggressive pounding. Before I could even turn away from the window to check the security monitors mounted on the wall, the door was shoved violently open. My mother and sister barged directly into my entryway, bringing the bitter, desperate energy of a sinking ship right into my peaceful sanctuary. They had completely bypassed the building concierge, likely slipping into a resident elevator behind an unsuspecting delivery worker or a careless neighbor. Beatrice marched straight into my pristine quartz kitchen, her designer Burberry trench coat billowing behind her like a dark storm cloud. Kiara trailed closely, looking unusually disheveled. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, stripped of their usual arrogant sparkle. The flawless, smug composure they had both worn, like impenetrable armor at the holiday dinner, was entirely gone. In its place was a frantic, vibrating desperation that bordered on madness. They did not come to apologize for throwing me out of the house on Christmas. They did not come to ask how I was doing or to inquire about the husband I had mentioned. Beatrice did not even bother offering a basic greeting. She reached aggressively into her oversized leather tote bag, pulled out a thick, heavy stack of stapled legal documents, and slammed them down onto my kitchen island. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the stone countertop echoed loudly in the quiet apartment. "Sign these right now," Beatrice demanded, tapping her manicured fingernails sharply against the signature line on the top page. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths, and her eyes were wide with a manic, obsessive intensity. "I brought a pen. We do not have the luxury of time to sit here and waste hours arguing about your ridiculous attitude or your petty grudges. You are going to sign on the dotted line right this second, Sienna, and we are going to fix this disaster." I did not flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, savoring the bitter warmth of the coffee before slowly lowering the porcelain cup. I looked down at the thick stack of papers, reading the bold legal headers, and then looked back up at my mother's flushed face. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It is a guarantor agreement for a commercial bridge loan," Kiara snapped, stepping out from behind our mother. Her voice was shrill, teetering on the very edge of a total hysterical breakdown. Vanguard officially suspended the acquisition deal on Christmas night. The news leaked to the board of directors yesterday morning. The suspension immediately triggered a margin call from Trent's primary venture capital backers. They are demanding immediate repayment of their initial seed money by Friday, or they are forcing the company into involuntary bankruptcy and initiating a lawsuit for fraud. We need a massive injection of liquid cash right this second to keep the creditors at bay, while Trent clears up this ridiculous fabricated audit. I looked back down at the documents, feeling a dark, incredulous sense of amusement wash over me. The sheer entitlement required to execute this ambush was almost impressive. "And you brought this to me?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "You drove all the way downtown, broke into my secure building, and barged into my home to demand that I co-sign a high-interest commercial loan for a man who publicly humiliated me 3 nights ago. Do not play games with us, Sienna," Beatrice hissed, her voice dripping with venomous authority. She slammed her hand on the counter again. "This is not about your fragile ego. This is about protecting our family prestige. Trent is on the verge of losing everything. If his company goes under, the social fallout in Buckhead will be absolutely catastrophic for all of us. I will not have my friends at the country club whispering about my daughter's husband being a failure." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked around my apartment with visible disdain. You have a stable corporate salary. You live in this cramped, overpriced rental apartment with very few overhead expenses. You have excellent credit because you never do anything ambitious with your life. Trent desperately needs your clean financial profile to secure this emergency capital. You will put your corporate salary down as collateral to back this loan, and you will do it today because it is your duty to this family. Let me make sure I fully understand this, I said, setting my espresso cup down and crossing my arms over my chest. You want me to risk my entire professional livelihood, my credit, and my financial security to save Trent? The same Trent who called me a bitter, jealous spinster. The same Trent who mocked my career. You want me to sacrifice my security so you can maintain your fraudulent status among wealthy women who do not actually care about you. It is called family loyalty, Kiara screamed, her face turning a blotchy, furious red. Something you know absolutely nothing about. We are supposed to protect each other. Trent is the only person in this family bringing us real wealth. Your job means nothing compared to what he is building. Stop being so incredibly selfish and sign the damn papers. I am not signing anything, I replied smoothly, setting my espresso cup down on the pristine white quartz countertop with a soft, definitive click. I looked at the thick stack of legal documents, then back into my mother's manic, desperate eyes. I am not attaching my name, my immaculate credit score, or my hard-earned corporate salary to a burning building just to save a fraud. Trent made his bed out of lies, and now he can lie in it while the federal government audits the sheets. The silence that followed my refusal was heavy, suffocating, and highly volatile. For a fraction of a second, Beatrice simply stared at me, her eyelids fluttering rapidly, her mouth slightly ajar, as if she physically could not process the auditory information I had just delivered. In her isolated, curated universe, her commands were absolute law. She had spent 35 years dictating the financial and emotional currents of our family, seamlessly moving resources to whichever child, meaning Kiara, best served her narcissistic image at any given moment. The concept of me, the designated family scapegoat, looking her dead in the eye and flatly denying her access to my financial stability was a reality she was completely unprepared to navigate. Then the shock morphed entirely into unadulterated volcanic rage. "You selfish, ungrateful little bitch!" Beatrice erupted, her voice tearing through the quiet elegance of my morning, shattering the peaceful atmosphere of the penthouse. She slammed both of her hands flat against the countertop, leaning her entire body weight forward. The veins in her neck protruded sharply against her expensive diamond necklace. "You do not have a choice, Sienna. You are going to sign this paperwork right now, or I swear to God you will be personally responsible for the complete eradication of our family's entire history." I crossed my arms over my silk robe, completely unfazed by her aggressive posturing. "The only person responsible for eradicating history is the man who faked his company's revenue streams. My signature is not going on that paper, Mother. You can scream until your lungs give out, but the answer is definitively, permanently no." "You don't understand," Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking painfully. She was losing every ounce of the refined, untouchable Buckhead matriarch persona she had spent decades cultivating. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room, welling with thick, desperate tears. "Trent's initial seed investors are demanding $2 million in liquid cash by Friday. $2 million. Sienna Vanguard was supposed to clear the $50 million acquisition by next week. The bridge loan was just supposed to be a temporary 2-week holdover. I had to secure the capital to keep Trent afloat until the Vanguard check cleared." I narrowed my eyes, a cold, sinking suspicion suddenly taking root in the pit of my stomach. Beatrice was a wealthy woman by standard measures, living off my late father's life insurance and some modest investments, but she absolutely did not have $2 million in liquid cash just sitting in a checking account. Her wealth was tied up entirely in image designer clothes, luxury leased vehicles, and the expensive maintenance of her social status. "Where did you get $2 million to give to Trent, Mother?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "What exactly did you use as collateral for that initial bridge loan?" Beatrice flinched as if I had physically struck her across the jaw. She looked away, her trembling hands gripping the edges of the quartz counter so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, sickly white. Kiara stepped backward, suddenly refusing to make eye contact with me, her lower lip quivering uncontrollably as she stared at the hardwood floor. "Tell me what you did." I commanded, the absolute authority in my voice, leaving no room for evasion or lies. "I took out a second mortgage." Beatrice whispered the words tumbling out of her mouth in a rapid, shameful rush. She closed her eyes tightly, hot tears finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks and ruining her flawless makeup. "I went to the executives at First Atlanta Bank. They know our family. They know our legacy. I signed the paperwork 3 weeks ago. I leveraged the estate. I took out a $2 million loan against Big Mama's house." The air in my lungs vanished instantly. The ground beneath my feet felt as though it had abruptly given way, plunging me into an icy abyss. Big Mama's house. It was not just a piece of real estate. It was a sprawling, historic, Victorian-style estate nestled deep in the heart of Atlanta. It was the sacred beating heart of our ancestral bloodline. My great-grandfather had purchased that land with cash he saved from decades of backbreaking, grueling physical labor during an era when Black men were systematically denied the right to own property. It was a monumental achievement of generational wealth for a Black family in the South, a physical, towering fortress of triumph, endurance, and profound legacy. My grandmother, Big Mama, had meticulously maintained every inch of that mahogany staircase, every rose bush in the expansive gardens. When she passed away, she left the property free and clear to Beatrice, with the strict, sacred understanding that the house was never to be sold, never to be leveraged, and always to remain a safe haven for our bloodline. And Beatrice had secretly mortgaged it. She had taken the blood, sweat, and immense sacrifices of our ancestors and handed it over to a predatory bank on a silver platter, all to secure a high-interest toxic loan for a fraudulent white tech bro who viewed our family as nothing more than an ATM for his own arrogant ambitions. "You mortgaged our legacy." I stated, the words tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "You bet Big Mama's house on Trent's fabricated company. It was a guaranteed return." Beatrice screamed, her desperation instantly mutating back into vicious, blame-shifting anger. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face, her eyes wild with delusion. "Trent promised me the Vanguard deal was fully secured. He promised the audit was just a formality. We were supposed to pay off the bank next week and keep the millions in profit. But you ruined it. You had to open your bitter, jealous mouth at Christmas dinner." She took a step toward me, her face twisted in a mask of pure, irrational hatred. "If you had just sat there, eaten your food, and kept your mouth shut, the Vanguard executives would have never suspended the deal. Trent would have his $50 million, the bank would be paid, and our family would be royalty. This is entirely your fault, Sienna. If Trent goes under on Friday. First, Atlanta is executing the foreclosure clause by the end of the month. They are going to seize Big Mama's house. They are going to throw me out onto the street. You destroyed this family with your petty jealousy, and now you are going to sign these papers to fix it." The sheer staggering audacity of Beatrice's logic hung in the air, a toxic cloud of delusion that defied all human reason. She had gambled the sacred crown jewel of our ancestors on a criminal Ponzi scheme, lost the bet entirely because of her own blinding greed, and was now fiercely determined to blame the whistleblower for the fire. I stared at her, feeling a strange, profound sense of absolute calm wash over me. The final, microscopic thread of daughterly obligation I had been unconsciously holding on to snapped entirely. Before I could articulate my final, uncompromising refusal, a blur of motion caught the corner of my eye. Kiara lunged forward, driven by a volatile, dangerous cocktail of impending bankruptcy, shattered entitlement, and the terrifying realization that her luxury lifestyle was vaporizing into thin air. She closed the distance between us in a single desperate stride. She raised her manicured hand, her heavy diamond engagement ring flashing in the morning light, and brought it down across my face with all the physical strength she could muster. Smack. The sharp, violent sound of the slap echoed loudly against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the penthouse. My head snapped violently to the side, the sudden impact leaving a burning hot red imprint across my left cheekbone. A sharp sting radiated through my jaw, vibrating all the way down to my collarbone. But I did not stumble. I did not raise my hand to cradle my injured face. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned my head back slowly, deliberately, and looked at my sister with a gaze so entirely devoid of emotion, so chillingly vacant and predatory, that Kiara immediately took a terrified step backward. Her own hand trembled wildly in the air, suddenly realizing she had just struck a wall of solid ice. "You selfish, bitter, pathetic spinster!" Kiara screamed, though her voice wavered with unmistakable fear. Tears of pure, unadulterated panic streamed down her flawless makeup. "You are deliberately trying to ruin the only successful man this family has ever seen. Trent is a visionary. He is a genius. You are just a glorified public relations worker sitting in a tiny cubicle. You have no husband. You have no future. You are letting our grandmother's house get repossessed by the bank just to satisfy your own sick, twisted vendetta against my happiness. Sign the damn papers, Sienna, or I swear I will make sure everyone in Atlanta knows exactly what a monster you are." I did not respond to her pathetic, hysterical monologue. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction, nor did I return the physical violence. True power does not need to throw a tantrum. Instead, I slowly turned my back on both of them. I walked calmly across the imported hardwood floors of my kitchen, my bare feet silent against the polished surface. I approached the sleek digital intercom panel mounted seamlessly into the wall near the grand entryway. I pressed the silver button with one steady finger holding it down. "You think calling the front desk of this cheap rental building is going to scare us?" Beatrice sneered from behind me, her voice dripping with triumphant malice. She completely misread my silence as submission or fear. She adjusted her designer trench coat, crossing her arms smugly over her chest. "Go ahead. Call the concierge. They can't do anything to me. In fact, when Trent's company goes under and our family is ruined, I'll personally make sure the bank comes after your assets next. You'll be evicted from this cramped, overpriced little apartment by the end of the month anyway. You are nothing without this family's name, Sienna." "Security!" I spoke clearly into the intercom, completely ignoring my mother's delusional, desperate threats. "Please send the chief property manager to Penthouse 1 immediately. I have 2 hostile trespassers who need an immediate permanent escort off the premises." "Hostile trespassers!" Kiara scoffed, letting out a wet, mocking laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You are so incredibly dramatic. You don't own anything, Sienna. You just rent space in a building full of people who are actually important. They are going to laugh in your face." We stood in absolute silence for exactly 60 seconds. The tension in the room was so thick, it could have been sliced with a scalpel. Beatrice and Kiara stood side by side, projecting a united front of arrogant superiority, fully believing that whoever walked through those doors would undoubtedly side with the impeccably dressed buckhead matriarch over the supposedly struggling single daughter. The heavy soundproof front door clicked open. Mr. Harrison, the chief property manager of the entire residential high-rise, stepped into the entryway. He was an older, highly distinguished gentleman who had managed elite luxury properties in New York and London before relocating to Atlanta. He was dressed in an immaculate, tailor-made navy blue suit, a gold lapel pin gleaming sharply on his jacket. He was flanked by 2 massive, broad-shouldered security guards wearing tactical black uniforms and earpieces. Beatrice immediately puffed out her chest, preparing to deliver a commanding, highly fabricated story about a family dispute to get the manager on her side. She opened her mouth to speak, to weaponize her class and status against me. But Mr. Harrison completely ignored her. He did not even glance in her direction. He walked purposefully past Beatrice and Kiara, stopping precisely 3 feet in front of me. To the absolute mind-shattering horror of my mother and sister, Mr. Harrison bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable professional respect. "Is everything all right, Madam Chairwoman?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice echoing with absolute deference and unwavering loyalty. "The perimeter is entirely secure. The concierge who allowed these unauthorized individuals into the private elevator bank has already been terminated. Your private security detail is on standby, and your personal driver has your car running in the subterranean VIP garage whenever you are ready to depart. She looked around the massive, sprawling penthouse, taking in the custom architectural details, the multi-million-dollar art pieces on the walls, the panoramic, unobstructed views of the Atlanta skyline with new, horrified eyes. She suddenly realized this was not a cramped, overpriced rental apartment. Yes, Mr. Harrison replied coldly, finally turning to look at Beatrice with a gaze of unmasked professional disdain. Ms. Sienna is not a tenant. She is the majority stakeholder of the real estate development group that built this tower. She owns this entire luxury building, and you are currently trespassing on her private residential floor. The absolute silence that followed Mr. Harrison's revelation was the most beautiful, intoxicating sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a 35-year-old hierarchy shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Beatrice's jaw physically dropped, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish hauled out of the ocean. The color violently drained from her face, leaving her usually vibrant, heavily powdered skin looking like a beautifully dressed, decaying corpse. Kiara let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth as she stumbled backward, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. "Madam, chairwoman," Beatrice whispered again. The words choked in her throat, her brain desperately, frantically trying to process the impossible, world-altering reality unfolding before her eyes. She looked around the massive, sprawling penthouse with new, horrified eyes. She finally took in the custom architectural details. She had previously dismissed the imported Italian marble, the multi-million-dollar original art pieces hanging on the walls, the panoramic, unobstructed views of the Atlanta skyline that only came with a 50-story elevation. She suddenly painfully realized that this was not a cramped, overpriced rental apartment. This was the fortress of a titan. "Yes," Mr. Harrison replied coldly, finally turning to look at Beatrice with a gaze of unmasked professional disdain. "Ms. Sienna is not a tenant. She is the majority stakeholder of the real estate development group that built this tower. She owns this entire luxury building, and you are currently trespassing on her private residential floor. Gentlemen, please escort these two women to the service elevator." The two massive security guards stepped forward, instantly moving with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. They did not gently ask my mother and sister to leave. They physically imposed themselves, their sheer size forcing Beatrice and Kiara to backpedal toward the grand entryway. "Wait, Sienna, wait!" Beatrice stammered, her voice pitching into a hysterical, high-octane screech. The arrogant, demanding matriarch had entirely vanished, replaced by a terrified woman who suddenly realized she had just demanded a multi-millionaire co-sign a bridge loan for a bankrupt fraud. "Sienna, you own this building. You have this kind of money, then you can easily pay off the bank. You can save Big Mama's house with pocket change. Sienna, tell them to stop. I am your mother." I did not tell them to stop. I did not even look at her as I walked over to the entryway console, casually picking up my tailored cashmere coat and my leather handbag. I slipped the coat over my shoulders, adjusting the collar with meticulous care. "Escort them out, Mr. Harrison," I said calmly, stepping past my mother as the guards corralled her into the private vestibule. "I have a meeting downtown. I am already running late." "Sienna, you cannot do this," Kiara wailed, struggling futilely against the imposing frame of the security guard, who was expertly steering her out the door. The sting on my cheek from her slap was still fresh, a physical reminder of the violence they resorted to when they lost control. "We are your family. Trent needs that money. We will lose everything." I followed them out of the penthouse and into the private, gold-trimmed elevator bank. The guards ushered my mother and sister toward the utilitarian service elevator down the hall, while I stepped gracefully into my own private, glass-paneled express car. Beatrice dug her heels into the carpet, fighting the guards with a sudden burst of frantic adrenaline. She managed to break free just long enough to sprint toward my closing elevator doors. She slapped her hands against the thick glass, her face twisted in a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. "Sienna, please!" Beatrice screamed, tears ruining her expensive mascara, leaving dark, ugly streaks down her face. "The bank is going to take the house. First Atlanta is going to foreclose by the end of the month. You have the power to stop this. You have the money. If you do not help us, our legacy is gone forever. I pressed the button to hold the doors open for one final suspended second. I looked directly into my mother's bloodshot, panicked eyes. I felt no pity. I felt no obligation. I only felt the cold, sharp precision of a surgeon making the final incision. The bank holding the mortgage on Big Mama's house is First Atlanta, right? I asked, my voice echoing smoothly in the marble hallway. Yes, yes, First Atlanta, Beatrice sobbed, nodding frantically, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope suddenly igniting in her eyes. She thought I was asking for the details so I could write a check. She thought her tears had finally worked. Well, I said, a slow, lethal smile spreading across my face. You might want to call your loan officer and check exactly who bought First Atlanta's entire portfolio of toxic debt this morning at 8 a.m. The glimmer of hope in Beatrice's eyes extinguished, instantly replaced by a sudden catastrophic understanding. Her jaw went completely slack. She realized in that split second that I wasn't just wealthy. I was the executioner. I had not just refused to save her. I had actively purchased the axe. I released the button. The heavy gold-trimmed elevator doors slid smoothly shut, completely cutting off Beatrice's agonizing, ear-piercing scream as she realized her daughter now owned the mortgage she had fraudulently secured. The elevator descended rapidly, plunging me toward the subterranean VIP garage, leaving the shattered, weeping remnants of my abusers trapped on the 50th floor. 2 weeks later, the air in Atlanta had grown even colder, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the freezing desperation radiating from Trent's crumbling corporate empire. Vanguard Holdings had kept the suspension of the $50 million acquisition completely quiet from the mainstream press, adhering to strict corporate non-disclosure policies during an active forensic audit. Because the news had not yet hit the major financial networks, Trent was desperately trying to exploit the narrow, rapidly closing window of public ignorance. He was bleeding money. His initial seed investors were threatening to file a massive class action lawsuit for wire fraud, and he was cornered like a rabid animal. His strategy: fake it until he made it, or more accurately, fake it until he could secure enough emergency capital from unsuspecting local investors to replace the Vanguard money before the federal indictments dropped. To project an illusion of unstoppable success, Trent decided to host a lavish, over-the-top New Year's Eve gala at the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Atlanta. He drained the absolute last dwindling reserves of his company's operating accounts to rent the grand ballroom, hire a live jazz orchestra, and import crates of vintage champagne. It was a classic, pathetic smokescreen. If he looked like a tech billionaire celebrating a historic buyout, the local Buckhead elite and naive venture capitalists might just write him the checks he desperately needed to cover his fraudulent tracks. I knew all of this, of course. My crisis management firm was monitoring every single transaction he made. I knew he was broke. I knew he was terrified. What I did not expect was the heavy gold-embossed envelope that arrived via private courier at my penthouse on the morning of December 31st. I opened the thick cardstock to find a VIP invitation to Trent's New Year's Eve gala. Tucked inside the luxurious envelope was a small cream-colored note card. Across the card, scrawled in Trent's aggressive, messy handwriting, was a petty, spiteful message. "Come see how the real elite make money, you lying fraud. P.S. Don't bother bringing your imaginary husband. We wouldn't let him in anyway." I stood in my kitchen holding the note and genuinely laughed out loud. It was a rich, full-bellied laugh that echoed through the penthouse. The sheer, unyielding arrogance of a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows taunting the woman holding the lever was truly a sight to behold. He actually believed he had outsmarted Vanguard. He believed his gala would save him. I decided right then and there that I would absolutely attend. It was time to pull the lever. Hours later, the opulent ballroom of the Four Seasons hummed with the desperate, frantic energy of a sinking ship, masked by crystal chandeliers and expensive perfumes. Trent had spared absolutely no expense. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of Dom Perignon, while a massive, intricately carved ice sculpture of his company's logo slowly melted in the center of the room. The local elite of the Atlanta tech and real estate sectors mingled, oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on the deck of the Titanic. I arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. I did not sneak in through the back. I walked through the towering main doors of the ballroom, moving with a deliberate, lethal grace. I wore a custom floor-length emerald green silk gown that clung perfectly to my silhouette, the fabric catching the warm, golden light of the chandeliers with every step. My hair was styled in sleek, cascading waves, and a diamond tennis necklace, a gift I had bought for myself to celebrate my firm's record-breaking fiscal year, glittered sharply against my collarbone. I looked breathtaking. I looked powerful. But most importantly to the predators lurking in the room, I arrived entirely alone. Across the sea of tailored suits and sequined dresses, I spotted them immediately. My mother Beatrice and my sister Kiara were holding court near the extravagant caviar station. Kiara was wearing a heavily beaded silver dress that looked like it weighed 20 pounds. She was leaning closely into the ear of a wealthy elderly socialite, but her eyes were locked entirely onto me. The moment Kiara saw that I was unaccompanied, a nasty, triumphant smirk twisted her features. The absolute terror she had displayed in my penthouse 2 weeks ago vanished, replaced by the comforting, familiar high school mean girl energy she always used as a crutch. In her twisted mind, the fact that I showed up to a New Year's Eve gala without a date confirmed her deepest, most desperate hope that I was lying about my marriage, that I was a lonely spinster, and that my display of wealth was somehow a temporary fluke. I watched her whisper maliciously to the women around her, nodding her head in my direction. The wealthy socialites turned to look at me, their eyes scanning my solitary figure, their mouths pulling into tight, synchronized smiles of aristocratic pity. Kiara was undoubtedly spinning a pathetic, fabricated narrative about my arrival, assuring her friends that I was a jealous, unstable sister who had come to beg for a handout from Trent's massive success. I did not avert my gaze. I did not shrink under their judgmental stares. I simply held Kiara's gaze from across the room, letting a cold, knowing smile touch my lips. The psychological warfare had officially commenced, and they had absolutely no idea that the battlefield was rigged with explosives. I continued my slow, measured progression toward the exact center of the grand ballroom, effortlessly navigating the throngs of oblivious, champagne-soaked investors. I knew exactly what was about to happen. A cornered animal always resorts to its most primitive, desperate instincts, and my family possessed only one predictable tactic when faced with a perceived threat to their social standing: highly public, vicious humiliation. Kiara detached herself from her group of gossiping friends. In her right hand, she clutched a completely full glass of dark, heavy Pinot Noir. She began moving toward me, charting an aggressive, intercepting path through the elegant crowd. Beatrice followed closely behind her, her face rapidly arranging itself into a practiced mask of deep maternal concern that did not quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. I stopped walking. I planted my heels firmly onto the plush, patterned carpet of the ballroom floor and waited for the inevitable collision. I did not brace myself. I simply watched them approach with clinical fascination. Kiara picked up her pace, her eyes darting quickly around the room to gauge the size of the audience surrounding us. Just as she closed the final gap, bringing her within striking distance, she executed her pathetic, rehearsed performance. She let out a sharp, exaggerated gasp, her ankle suddenly buckling in a spectacularly fake stumble. She thrust her arm forward with the precision of a professional pitcher, hurling the entire contents of her crystal glass directly at my chest. The dark red wine exploded across the immaculate emerald silk of my custom designer gown. It splashed violently against my bare collarbone and dripped heavily, thickly down the expensive, delicate fabric. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the immediate vicinity. Conversations died instantly, replaced by the sharp, ringing silence of high society scandal. The cold liquid soaked rapidly through my silk dress, blossoming into a dark, spreading stain of manufactured shame. Kiara dramatically caught her balance, pressing a manicured hand against her heavily beaded chest, in a theatrical display of profound shock. "Oh my God, Sienna, I am so incredibly sorry," Kiara cried out, her voice unnaturally loud, perfectly calibrated to carry across the suddenly quiet room and draw the attention of the wealthiest investors present. I completely lost my footing. You just appeared out of nowhere. I had absolutely no idea you would actually show up here tonight, especially all by yourself. She did not offer me a napkin. She did not reach out to help dab the wine away. She simply stood there basking in the warm glow of my ruined appearance, a vicious, triumphant gleam of pure satisfaction dancing in her eyes. I did not flinch, I did not scream, I did not scramble frantically to wipe the spreading crimson stain from my bodice. I simply looked down at the ruined silk, feeling the cold wine seep against my skin, and then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. The absolute statue-like stillness of my reaction visibly unnerved her. She had expected me to break down, to cry, to yell, or to flee the ballroom in absolute tearful disgrace. Instead, I stood my ground, watching her pathetic performance with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. Before the awkward ringing silence could stretch any further, Beatrice stepped directly into the spotlight. She positioned herself between me and the murmuring crowd, placing a hand over her heart, to play the role of the tragic, long-suffering matriarch. She knew I had the power to destroy them financially, so her only remaining strategy was to destroy my credibility socially. If she painted me as a lunatic, nobody in this ballroom would believe a word I said. "Please, everyone, I ask for your forgiveness and your grace," Beatrice announced, her voice trembling with a masterclass display of theatrical sorrow. She projected her words loudly enough for the venture capitalists, the tech bloggers, and the socialites to hear every single syllable. "My youngest daughter is not well. She has been struggling with severe, heartbreaking psychiatric issues for quite some time now." The crowd leaned in, mesmerized by the unfolding drama. "We have tried everything to get her the professional help she so desperately needs," Beatrice continued, wiping a fake tear from the corner of her eye. "But she aggressively refuses to accept reality. She suffers from terrible, tragic delusions of grandeur. She actually believes she possesses immense wealth, claiming to own high-rises and corporations. She even fabricates elaborate ongoing stories about a fake marriage to cope with her deep, profound loneliness. We are just so incredibly heartbroken that she chose to wander into Trent's magnificent celebration tonight to act out these fantasies." The surrounding crowd reacted exactly as Beatrice had orchestrated. A low collective murmur of deep pity and harsh, hushed judgment swept through the wealthy onlookers. Women in sequined dresses whispered behind their expensive clutch purses, shaking their heads in synchronized sympathy for the poor, embarrassed mother. The men in tailored tuxedos cast uncomfortable sidelong glances at my wine-soaked dress, viewing me not as a human being, but as a tragic spectacle, a broken, delusional woman who had rudely interrupted a night of elite celebration. I listened to the whispers, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of my mother's public assassination of my character. It was a classic textbook crisis management tactic: aggressively discredit the whistleblower before the whistle is even blown. I looked at Beatrice, then at Kiara, committing their triumphant, sneering faces to absolute memory. They desperately wanted a public spectacle tonight. They had absolutely no idea how massive of a spectacle I was fully prepared to give them. I did not reach for a napkin. I did not raise my voice to passionately defend myself against my mother's vile, fabricated medical diagnosis. Defending yourself against a lie only gives the liar validation. It drags you down into the mud where they have the advantage. Instead, I simply reached into my emerald green clutch and retrieved my smartphone. The OLED screen illuminated my face in the dim, golden light of the ballroom. Kiara let out a harsh, mocking laugh, leaning closer to her circle of sycophants. She clearly assumed I was frantically calling a car service to flee the scene in tears. Beatrice placed a comforting maternal hand on Kiara's shoulder, projecting the image of a protective matriarch shielding her successful daughter from the crazy sister. Through the crowd, Trent pushed his way to the front, a fresh glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. He stood directly next to Kiara, wrapping a possessive, arrogant arm around her waist. His face was flushed with alcohol and victory. He looked down at my stained dress and smirked, fully believing he had decisively won the war. He opened his mouth to offer some condescending remark, likely about calling hotel security, to safely escort the unstable woman to the exit. I did not give him the chance to speak. I unlocked my phone using facial recognition, opened my highly secure encrypted corporate messaging application, and pulled up the active thread with my lead crisis management investigator, who was currently sitting in a surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. I typed 3 simple, devastating words: initiate liquidation protocol. I pressed send. I slipped the phone back into my clutch, snapped it shut with a definitive click, and let my hands fall to my sides. I kept my eyes locked directly on Trent, waiting for the digital shockwave to hit his fragile, fraudulent empire. It took exactly 12 seconds. The change began with a high-pitched, agonizing screech of audio feedback that violently ripped through the ballroom's sophisticated sound system. The live jazz band on the stage stopped playing abruptly, the musicians lowering their brass instruments and looking around in sheer confusion. A collective murmur of annoyance rippled through the elite crowd. Guests adjusted their tuxedos and checked their luxury watches, assuming the hotel was experiencing a temporary power surge. Trent frowned, stepping away from Kiara to angrily wave down a passing event coordinator. He was visibly furious that his perfect, expensive celebration had been interrupted by a technical glitch. Then the massive LED screens surrounding the entire perimeter of the ballroom flickered to life. These screens had been rented at an exorbitant cost, specifically to play a continuous, sleek promotional loop of Trent's startup graphs, pointing upward happy stock footage users and endless buzzwords. For a split second, every single screen in the massive room went completely pitch black. Then a stark, glaring white document filled every display. The text was massive, undeniable, and perfectly legible from every single corner of the vast ballroom. It was a scanned, certified copy of an international wire transfer. The document clearly showed over $3 million being illegally funneled directly from the startup's primary operating account into a hidden, untraceable offshore shell company located in the Cayman Islands. The receiving account was registered entirely and explicitly under Trenton Miller's personal name. The murmurs of annoyance in the crowd instantly transformed into sharp, audible gasps of genuine shock. Investors, venture capitalists, and tech journalists, people who had just spent the last 2 hours drinking Trent's champagne and listening to his aggressive pitches, stepped closer to the glowing screens, their eyes widening in absolute disbelief. Trent froze. The muscles in his face went completely slack. The crystal glass of bourbon slipped entirely from his trembling fingers, plummeting to the polished marble floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Before anyone could fully process the reality of the wire transfer, the screens glitched again with a sharp burst of static. The image rotated seamlessly, displaying a complex, undeniable spreadsheet. It was the master database of Trent's startup. The screen highlighted the exact proprietary algorithm Trent had illegally purchased from a Russian vendor to generate millions of fake daily active users. It was the mathematical, irrefutable proof that his company was an empty digital ghost town. "Turn it off!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking wildly with pure, unadulterated terror. He lunged toward the nearest audiovisual control panel on the wall, frantically mashing buttons with his fists, but the entire system had been locked out by my cybersecurity team. "Somebody cut the power right now. This is a malicious hack. Nobody look at those screens." But the presentation was not finished. The grand finale flashed across the massive screens. It was an email thread captured directly from Trent's supposedly secure private server. The date stamp was from exactly 3 weeks ago. The message was addressed to his lead software developer. The text was highlighted in bright yellow for everyone to read. "We need to artificially inflate the engagement metrics by at least 40% before the Vanguard auditors arrive next week. The initial investors are getting suspicious about our current burn rate. Do whatever it takes to fake the user logs. If Vanguard sees the real numbers, they will pull the $50 million offer, and we will all be facing federal prison for massive wire fraud. Just make the numbers look good." The ballroom descended into absolute catastrophic chaos. The wealthy guests erupted into furious overlapping shouting. Men in tailored suits whipped out their cell phones, frantically dialing their legal teams and their wealth managers. Women backed away from Beatrice and Kiara as if the two women were suddenly radiating a highly contagious, lethal disease. Kiara stood frozen, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth, staring up at the glowing screens in pure, unblinking horror. The fantasy life she had built, the social superiority she had wielded like a weapon, was dissolving into ash right before her eyes. Beatrice spun around wildly, desperately trying to grab the arms of her wealthy friends, trying to explain that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, a cruel prank orchestrated by her sick daughter. But her friends violently pulled their arms away in absolute disgust, their faces twisting with harsh, unforgiving judgment. Trent was hyperventilating, his hands pulling frantically at his own hair, as he screamed at the hotel event staff to physically smash the LED screens with chairs. He looked wildly around the room, his panicked, bloodshot eyes finally locking onto mine. I stood perfectly still in the very center of the madness, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute peace wash over my tired soul. The dark red wine dripped slowly down the front of my ruined emerald gown, a poetic stark contrast to the bright white light radiating from the damning screens suspended high above the stage. I did not move. I did not blink. I simply watched the arrogant architect of my family's destruction burn alive in the inescapable fires of his own making. Trent stared at the massive, glowing screens suspended above the stage, his chest heaving with violent, erratic breaths. The veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his starched white collar, as the undeniable evidence of his massive financial fraud remained illuminated for every wealthy investor, tech journalist, and socialite in Atlanta to see. He spun around his face, turning a deep, unnatural shade of purple. The sheer panic in his eyes rapidly mutated into a primal, unhinged rage. His eyes locked onto me, standing calmly in the center of the ballroom, and his face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. He raised a shaking hand, pointing his finger directly at my face, as if he were aiming a loaded weapon. "Grab her right now!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking loudly, tearing through the chaotic, overlapping murmurs of the panicked crowd. He looked frantically toward the perimeter of the room, waving wildly at the venue's staff. "Get hotel security in here right now and drag that lunatic out of my venue." She hacked the presentation. "This is an illegal cyber attack orchestrated by a disturbed, jealous woman. Do not let her leave. Have her arrested." Two bulky hotel security guards dressed in standard-issue black suits stepped forward from the edges of the ballroom. They looked highly hesitant, glancing nervously up at the damning federal bank statements still flashing across the digital displays, but Trent's relentless authoritative screaming propelled them into action. They pushed their way through the bewildered guests, moving aggressively toward me. Beatrice instantly stepped forward, positioning herself right beside Trent, sensing a final desperate opportunity to regain control of the narrative. She began yelling to the surrounding crowd, pointing at my wine-stained dress. "Do you not hear him? Remove her immediately!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing with manufactured hysteria. "My daughter is an unstable woman who has completely lost her mind. She hired someone to hack these screens. She is trying to destroy an innocent man out of pure psychotic jealousy." Kiara nodded vigorously, tears of sheer panic streaming down her ruined makeup. "Arrest her. She ruined my dress, and now she is trying to ruin my husband's company. Throw her in jail. Get her out of here." I did not move a single muscle. The dark red wine continued to drip slowly from the bodice of my ruined emerald gown, pooling silently on the polished marble floor. I watched the two security guards close the distance, their heavy hands reaching out to physically grab my bare arms. The surrounding investors backed away quickly, forming a wide, empty circle around me, watching the unfolding spectacle with wide eyes and hushed whispers. "Ma'am, you need to come with us right now," the larger security guard ordered, reaching his hand toward my shoulder, preparing to physically drag me out of the ballroom. Before his fingers could even brush the silk fabric of my dress, a deafening crash echoed through the cavernous space. The massive, solid oak double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung open with such sudden, violent force that they slammed loudly against the interior walls. The sharp, explosive sound cracked like a gunshot over the noisy crowd. Every single head in the room, including the security guards, Trent, Beatrice, and Kiara, snapped instantly toward the entrance. The guards froze entirely in their tracks, their hands dropping to their sides as they stared at the open doorway in absolute shock. Trent stopped screaming. Beatrice swallowed her venomous words. The relentless, panicked murmuring of the wealthy elite died down to a strained, breathless whisper. Through the grand entrance marched a tactical team of 6 elite bodyguards. They did not look like standard hotel security. They wore impeccably tailored identical black suits with discreet earpieces, moving with a synchronized military-grade precision that immediately communicated absolute, undeniable authority. They fanned out rapidly across the entrance, creating a wide, impenetrable perimeter. They physically, unapologetically pushed several bewildered tech executives out of the way, clearing a massive, unobstructed path down the center aisle of the magnificent ballroom. The air in the grand room grew instantly heavy and cold. The atmosphere shifted violently from chaotic confusion to palpable, suffocating fear. The elite investors and socialites of Atlanta recognized raw, unadulterated power when they saw it. They instinctively stepped back, parting like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against the cocktail tables to create a clear walkway from the grand entrance directly to where I stood patiently in the center of the floor. Then the powerful man himself stepped confidently over the polished marble threshold. Julian Sterling walked into the ballroom. He was a towering, deeply intimidating figure, standing well over 6 feet 2 inches tall, possessing the kind of commanding, magnetic physical presence that naturally drained the oxygen from any room he entered. He wore a custom dark charcoal Tom Ford suit that draped flawlessly across his broad shoulders, exuding a level of bespoke wealth that made the surrounding millionaires look incredibly cheap. His sharp, angular features were set into a mask of pure, absolute ice. His dark eyes scanned the massive room with a predatory calculation, taking in the panicked faces, the glowing screens broadcasting Trent's massive fraud, and finally resting directly on me. Julian Sterling was not just another wealthy, successful businessman attending a local gala. He was a famously legendary, notoriously ruthless billionaire venture capitalist. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. This was the very corporate empire Trent had falsely claimed would buy his startup for $50 million. Julian's reputation for ruthless efficiency, brilliant financial strategy, and destroying anyone who tried to cross him preceded him in every major financial sector across the entire globe. As he walked slowly, deliberately down the cleared path, the silence in the ballroom became absolute. You could hear the faint rustle of silk gowns and the shallow, nervous breathing of the powerful men standing nearby. Nobody dared to speak a word. Nobody dared to move an inch. The sheer gravity of his sudden arrival paralyzed the entire gathering. Trent stared at the approaching billionaire, his jaw hanging completely slack. He looked like a man who had just seen a terrifying, vengeful ghost. The remaining color vanished from his face, leaving him looking sickly, drenched in a sudden layer of cold, terrified sweat. However, driven by the blinding, desperate delusion that had fueled his entire career, Trent's brain radically misinterpreted the situation. He actually believed Julian Sterling had flown all the way to Atlanta to attend this New Year's Eve gala in person to celebrate the impending acquisition. He assumed Julian was looking at the hacked screens and needed an immediate groveling explanation to save the $50 million deal. "Mr. Sterling," Trent stammered, his voice cracking pitifully as he broke away from Kiara's side. Trent took a tentative, shaky step forward, moving to intercept the billionaire before he could walk any further into the room. He held both of his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture, completely ignoring the fact that Julian's elite bodyguards immediately tensed, ready to neutralize him. "Julian, please, sir, you have to listen to me," Trent babbled, sweat dripping down his forehead, soaking the collar of his expensive shirt. He reached his hand out desperately, trying to initiate a handshake with the most powerful man in the room. "This is all a massive, terrible misunderstanding. The screens, the data, the wire transfers. It is a malicious cyber attack, a prank. My company is completely sound. We are ready to close the acquisition with Vanguard tomorrow morning. You cannot possibly believe whatever nonsense this jealous woman is trying to project on those screens. Julian did not slow his pace. He did not break his stride. He looked at Trent's outstretched, sweating hand with the kind of profound, chilling disgust usually reserved for something foul, scraped off the bottom of a shoe. Julian did not say a single word to Trent. He simply kept walking, stepping smoothly around the frantic, babbling tech executive as if Trent were nothing more than a piece of discarded trash on the marble floor. Trent stumbled awkwardly, his hand left hanging entirely in the empty air, humiliated in front of the entire Atlanta elite. Julian walked straight past Beatrice, who was holding her breath, and past Kiara, who was trembling so violently she could barely stand. He walked directly into the center of the wide, empty circle the crowd had formed around me. He halted exactly 2 feet in front of me, his massive frame shielding me from the hundreds of staring eyes. The entire room waited completely paralyzed and suspended in a state of absolute terror, watching the most powerful man in the global corporate world stand face to face with the exact same woman they had all just spent the last 20 minutes mocking, harshly judging, and loudly condemning without mercy. Julian reached out his large, impeccably manicured hands, gently grasping the lapels of his custom charcoal suit jacket. In one fluid, seamless motion, he slid the heavy, expensive garment from his broad shoulders. He stepped even closer, completely invading my personal space in the most protective, intimate way possible. He wrapped the warm, heavy fabric securely around my trembling frame, the oversized jacket effectively and completely covering the dark red wine stain that had ruined my emerald gown. The scent of expensive cedar and crisp bergamot washed over me, grounding me instantly. His dark eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he looked down at me. He reached up his thumb, gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from my face, and leaned in. He pressed a soft, lingering, profoundly tender kiss to my forehead. The gesture was incredibly intimate, a jarring, mind-bending contrast to the terrifying aura of absolute authority he projected to the rest of the room. Julian then turned slightly, keeping one strong, protective arm wrapped securely around my waist. He reached out his free hand, plucking a wireless microphone directly from the trembling fingers of a completely dumbfounded event coordinator standing near the edge of the stage. Julian held the microphone up to his mouth. His deep, resonant voice echoed effortlessly through the silent, cavernous ballroom, carrying the lethal weight of an atomic bomb. "I apologize for being late, my darling wife." The payoff landed like a massive, catastrophic meteor striking the very center of the Four Seasons ballroom. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was so incredibly sharp and unified that it actually sucked the remaining oxygen from the room, creating a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. For a suspended, agonizing moment, the universe simply stopped spinning. The wealthy investors, the judgmental socialites, and the arrogant tech bros who had spent the entire evening looking down on me suddenly realized they were standing in the presence of apex predators. Beatrice's fingers went entirely slack. The delicate crystal champagne flute she had been gripping so tightly slipped from her manicured hand, plummeting toward the polished marble floor. It shattered with a sharp, violent crash, sending glittering shards of glass and expensive vintage liquor flying across the tiles. She did not even blink. Her eyes were stretched impossibly wide, staring at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked like a woman who had just realized she had spent her entire life gleefully dancing on top of a live, ticking landmine. Kiara looked physically ill. Her jaw literally dropped open, her mouth forming a silent, trembling circle. The smug, vicious satisfaction she had worn just moments ago when she hurled the red wine at my chest evaporated entirely, replaced by a devastating, crushing wave of absolute shock. Her knees knocked together under her heavy, beaded silver gown. She looked at me, wrapped safely and intimately in the protective embrace of a billionaire chief executive officer. And then she slowly turned her head to look at her own husband. Trent appeared as though he was going to violently vomit right there on the pristine marble floor. His chest heaved with shallow, frantic gasps, his face transforming from a sickly ashen gray to a pale, ghostly white. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically as his mind frantically, desperately tried to process the impossible world-ending reality unfolding before his eyes. The woman he had relentlessly mocked, the sister-in-law he had dismissed as a bitter, jealous spinster, the woman he had tried to have dragged out by hotel security, was legally married to the very man who held his entire financial future in the palm of his hand. Julian slowly turned his head. His dark eyes left my face and locked onto Trent. The sheer lethal coldness in his gaze made several nearby investors physically step backward, instinctively trying to put distance between themselves and the impending slaughter. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. True absolute power commands attention through quiet, terrifying precision. You actually thought Vanguard Holdings was just doing a standard routine financial audit? Julian asked, his voice dripping with profound, icy contempt. The microphone carried every syllable flawlessly to the furthest corners of the massive room. You honestly believed you could hand my underwriting team a spreadsheet filled with phantom users, fabricated engagement metrics, and illegal offshore wire transfers, and we would just blindly write you a $50 million check. Trent opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer some pathetic excuse, but absolutely no words came out. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in the inescapable, glaring spotlight of his own monumental greed. You are severely mistaken, Trent. Julian continued, his words striking like precise, deadly physical blows against Trent's crumbling ego. Vanguard Holdings does not gamble with capital. We protect our investments with absolute, uncompromising ruthlessness. We hired the most elite, aggressive corporate crisis management firm in the country exactly 6 months ago to investigate your pathetic shell of a company. We tasked them with tearing your entire digital infrastructure apart, tracing every single fraudulent dime you stole from your initial seed investors. Julian placed a firm, supportive hand on the small of my back, pulling me slightly closer to his side. He looked around the surrounding crowd of elite Atlanta investors, sweeping his gaze over the very people who had just whispered that I was insane, ensuring every single person in the ballroom heard his next sentence perfectly clearly. My wife is not just a consultant, Julian announced, the truth ringing through the room with undeniable, earth-shattering finality. She is the founder, the owner, and the active chairwoman of that elite crisis management firm. She personally led the forensic investigation into your fraudulent enterprise. She gathered every piece of damning evidence currently broadcasting on those screens above your head. And she is the one who officially authorized your complete, systematic destruction tonight. The silence in the ballroom deepened into something almost physical, a heavy weight pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. The revelation was absolute. Trent's knees buckled slightly, his hands shaking violently as the inescapable reality of his situation finally crushed him. He had not just failed an audit. He had insulted, degraded, and publicly humiliated the very woman who held the executioner's axe over his professional neck. He had invited her to his party just to mock her, proudly celebrating his own demise. You are finished, Trent, I said quietly, stepping slightly forward from the protective warmth of Julian's jacket, though his hand remained firmly anchored on my waist. Your company is dead. Your reputation is entirely eradicated. There is no acquisition. There is no $50 million payout. There is only the harsh, unavoidable consequence of your own staggering arrogance. I told you on Christmas that you were building houses out of cards, and now you get to watch the entire structure burn to the ground. Trent staggered backward as my words struck him. He looked desperately around the massive ballroom, searching frantically for a single sympathetic face among the wealthy elite, but he found absolutely nothing. The venture capitalists and local politicians who had been aggressively shaking his hand and drinking his expensive champagne just minutes ago were now actively backing away, treating him like a highly radioactive biohazard. He was completely isolated. Beatrice, however, could not remain frozen in her shock. The sheer suffocating panic of losing her social standing, combined with a sudden overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated greed, completely overrode her basic common sense. She saw Julian Sterling, a verified, legendary billionaire, standing just a few feet in front of her. Her twisted, narcissistic mind instantly recalibrated the catastrophic situation. If her youngest daughter was legally married to this level of unimaginable, limitless wealth, Beatrice naturally assumed she was inherently entitled to a share of the immense power. She broke away from Kiara's side. Her designer heels clicked frantically against the marble floor as she rushed directly toward us, completely ignoring the massive glowing screens broadcasting her golden son-in-law's federal crimes. She focused entirely on Julian. Julian! Beatrice cried out, her voice pitching into a sickeningly sweet, desperate register that made my skin crawl. She lunged forward, throwing her hands out to grab his tailored forearm. "Oh, my precious, wonderful son-in-law, I had absolutely no idea you were coming tonight. Sienna is always so terribly secretive with us. Please, Julian, you have to stop this madness right now." She pointed a trembling finger up at the massive LED displays. "You have to tell your people to turn those awful screens off immediately. This is a private family matter. We cannot air our dirty laundry in front of the entire city of Atlanta. You must save Trent. He is a good man who just made a few tiny, ambitious mistakes. For the sake of our family honor, you have to fix this before the media gets involved. We are family now, Julian, and family protects family." Julian looked down at the exact spot where Beatrice's manicured hands were clutching the sleeve of his custom charcoal suit. His expression did not change, but the temperature in the room seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. He pulled his arm away with a sharp, violent motion, a gesture of absolute, unadulterated disgust that nearly caused Beatrice to lose her balance and fall to the floor. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pristine white silk pocket square, and slowly, deliberately wiped the exact spot on his sleeve that she had just touched, as if she had left a physical smear of toxic sludge on the fabric. "Do not ever put your hands on me again." Julian stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried across the silent ballroom, vibrating with lethal intent. "And do not ever use the word family in my presence. You do not understand the definition of the word. My wife is the only family I acknowledge in this miserable city." Beatrice recoiled, her mouth opening and closing in shock. "But I am her mother. I raised her. I gave her everything. You gave her nothing but grief." Julian countered, his dark eyes narrowing with surgical precision. "You actively stole her college fund when she was 18, just to pamper a golden child who contributes absolutely nothing to society. You drained the generational wealth of your own ancestors just to maintain a fake image. You threw your youngest daughter out of your home on Christmas simply because her presence threatened your fraudulent, pathetic social climbing. People who behave like desperate parasites have absolutely no place in my presence. You mean nothing to me, and you mean nothing to her." Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst open for a third and final time. The loud commotion caused the remaining guests to gasp and press themselves flat against the decorated walls. A unified, heavily armed team of federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission marched rapidly into the venue, closely flanked by uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department. The flashing red and blue lights of their cruisers reflected wildly through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the street, casting an eerie, strobe-like glow over the opulent New Year's Eve decorations. The lead federal agent, a tall, severe-looking woman holding a thick leather folder, walked briskly down the center aisle. She did not look at the elite guests. Her eyes were locked entirely on the sweating, hyperventilating man standing near the stage. "Trenton Miller," the agent announced, her voice echoing loudly with absolute unyielding legal authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate systemic defrauding of venture capital investors. Keep your hands exactly where I can clearly see them right now." Trent let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper that sounded like a wounded animal. He tried to take a step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the service exits, but two heavily armed police officers flanked him instantly. They grabbed his arms, twisting them roughly behind his back, ignoring his cries of pain. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the definitive, undeniable sound of an arrogant empire collapsing into absolute ruin. "I did not do it!" Trent screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob as the officers began to drag him forcefully across the marble floor. It was just aggressive marketing. Everyone does it in the tech industry. You cannot do this to me. I am a visionary, Julian. Tell them it is just business. Please. Julian did not even blink. He simply turned his back on the screaming, disgraced executive and pulled me slightly closer to his side, shielding me from the pathetic display. The federal agents marched Trent directly through the crowd of horrified investors. The very people who had been aggressively shaking his hand and drinking his expensive champagne just an hour ago now stared at him with pure venomous disgust. He was paraded out of his own lavish celebration like a common, lowly criminal. His expensive suit wrinkled his dignity completely and permanently eradicated. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom slammed shut with a resounding, echoing thud, cutting off the muffled sounds of federal agents aggressively securing Trent into the back of a police cruiser. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, the flashing red and blue lights of the barricade slowly faded into the freezing Atlanta night, carrying away the arrogant architect of my family's fraudulent empire. Inside the luxurious venue, a deafening, suffocating silence returned, heavier and far more oppressive than before. The elite crowd, consisting of the wealthiest tech investors, real estate moguls, and high society socialites in the city, remained entirely paralyzed. Nobody reached for their smartphones to record the aftermath. Nobody whispered a single gossiping word to the person standing next to them. They simply stared at the absolute wreckage left behind in the very center of the dance floor. The glittering illusion of Trent's $50 million tech empire had been completely and surgically eradicated in a matter of minutes. The glamorous New Year's Eve celebration had violently transformed into an active federal crime scene, and the arrogant hosts were now disgraced radioactive outcasts. Julian stood perfectly still beside me, an immovable mountain of bespoke charcoal wool and quiet, lethal power. His large hand remained resting firmly on the small of my back, a constant physical anchor grounding me in the immediate aftermath of the absolute chaos. He completely ignored the stunned, staring crowd. His dark, calculating eyes were fixed entirely on the two women who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. The heavy fabric of his suit jacket wrapped securely around my shoulders, shielding me from the chill of the room and covering the dark, sticky stain of the red wine Kiara had violently thrown at my chest just half an hour ago. I looked down at the floor, taking in the shattered remnants of my abusers. It was Kiara who finally broke the profound, ringing silence of the ballroom. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail that sounded like a wounded, dying animal. The sound was so raw and pathetic that it echoed painfully against the vaulted ceilings, causing several guests to visibly flinch. Her entire identity, her core sense of self-worth, had been constructed exclusively around being the perfect daughter, who had successfully secured a wealthy white husband to elevate our family into the highest echelons of Buckhead society. With Trent arrested for massive federal wire fraud, that identity was instantly vaporized. The millions of dollars she had already started spending in her mind were gone. The designer clothes, the luxury sports cars, the exclusive country club memberships, all of it was built on a fragile foundation of lies that I had just publicly bulldozed into dust. She was no longer a tech billionaire's spoiled wife. She was the spouse of an indicted, soon-to-be convicted felon. Kiara collapsed entirely onto her hands and knees. The expensive, heavy beaded silk of her designer gown pooled around her on the cold marble floor, soaking up the spilled champagne from Beatrice's shattered glass and the sticky residue of my ruined wine. She ignored the mess. She ignored the hundreds of judgmental, aristocratic eyes burning holes into her back. Driven by sheer, unadulterated desperation, she began crawling directly toward me. Her manicured hands slipped frantically against the polished tiles as she scrambled across the short distance separating us. The golden child who had spent 35 years walking entirely over me, stepping on my neck to elevate herself, was now literally on her knees at my feet. She reached out with shaking, frantic hands and grabbed a thick fistful of my wine-stained emerald dress. Her knuckles turned stark white as she clung to the ruined silk fabric like a drowning woman grasping at a fragile life raft in the middle of a hurricane. "Sienna, please!" Kiara sobbed, her chest heaving violently as tears completely ruined her flawless, expensive makeup. Dark, ugly streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, dripping onto her diamond necklace. You have to stop this. You have to fix this right now. Tell Julian to call his lawyers. Tell him to drop the fraud investigation and pay Vanguard to bail Trent out. She looked up at Julian, her eyes wide with a manic, delusional hope. He is a billionaire, Sienna. He can make this entire federal case disappear with one phone call. He can pay off the SEC. You have the power to save us. We are your family. You cannot stand there and let the federal government take my husband away. When I did not respond, Kiara paused, gasping for air, her mind frantically searching for a new manipulation tactic. She looked back up at me, her eyes pleading, shifting to a narrative she had never once cared about until she needed a shield. You know exactly how the justice system treats people? Kiara begged, her voice dropping into a desperate conspiratorial whisper. We are Black women, Sienna. Black sisters have to stick together against the system. We have to protect our own blood. You cannot betray your own sister like this. You have to save us from them. Julian's entire body tensed instantly at the sheer, staggering audacity of her hypocritical words. I felt the thick, dense muscles in his arm lock tight as he prepared to step forward fully, intending to physically, forcefully remove her hands from my dress. He possessed absolutely no tolerance for people attempting to manipulate me. I raised my hand, gently pressing my palm flat against his broad chest to stop him. He looked down at me, his dark eyes flashing with intense protective fury, but he immediately respected my silent command. He stepped back exactly half an inch, allowing me the space and autonomy to personally handle the woman who had tormented me my entire life. I did not pull my dress away from Kiara's frantic grip. I simply looked down at her pathetic weeping face with absolute freezing detachment. You do not get to use that card tonight. I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the silent ballroom, carrying the sharp cutting edge of a perfectly sharpened blade. You do not get to weaponize our race or our bloodline just because you are finally facing the consequences of your own staggering greed. Kiara froze, her mouth opening in shock as my words struck her. You did not care about sisterhood when you stood in my kitchen 2 weeks ago and violently slapped me across the face in my own building. I continued, my voice steady, refusing to let her off the hook for a single transgression. You did not care about protecting Black women when you eagerly helped our mother drain my college fund to pamper yourself. You certainly did not care about sticking together when you intentionally hurled a glass of red wine at my chest 20 minutes ago, actively trying to humiliate me in front of this exact same crowd. I took a slow, deliberate, measured step backward. The firm, unyielding movement forced the expensive silk of my gown to slide violently out of her desperate, clinging fingers. Kiara immediately fell forward slightly, her hands hitting the cold marble floor with a dull smack as she lost her physical grip on my dress. I stared down at her, feeling absolutely no pity, no regret, and no sorrow for the profound devastation she had brought upon herself. Do not invoke the struggles of our community to excuse your husband's massive, calculated financial crimes. I concluded, my tone dropping to a lethal, unyielding whisper that paralyzed her completely. You only care about the system now because it finally caught you. Kiara remained sprawled on the cold marble floor, the sharp, undeniable truth of my words stripping away her final shred of misplaced entitlement. She did not offer a rebuttal. She could not. The absolute finality in my voice drained the remaining fight from her body. She simply lowered her head, weeping silently into the spilled champagne and ruined silk, completely broken. But the spectacular, catastrophic implosion of our family was not yet complete. A harsh, ragged gasping sound suddenly shattered the tense quiet of the ballroom. Beatrice was clutching the edge of a tall silver cocktail table, her knuckles stark white against the polished metal. Her entire body trembled violently, vibrating like a taut wire about to snap. The flawless, arrogant mask of the Buckhead matriarch had melted away entirely, revealing a terrified, desperate, aging woman staring directly into the terrifying abyss of her own financial ruin. Trent was currently sitting in the back of a federal police cruiser heading for a holding cell. That meant the Vanguard acquisition was dead. It meant the bridge loan would default. The immediate consequence of that reality struck Beatrice with the force of a physical, devastating blow. There would be no buyout, There would be no cash injection to satisfy the aggressive margin call on Trent's fraudulent startup. And worst of all, there was no money to pay back First Atlanta Bank. The house! Beatrice wheezed, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. Oh God, the house is gone! She let go of the cocktail table. Her legs, weakened by terror and shock, gave out completely beneath her. Beatrice, the woman who had spent 35 years demanding absolute perfection, ruthless poise, and aristocratic elegance from everyone around her, collapsed heavily onto her knees. She landed just a few feet away from her weeping golden child. The elite investors and socialites who had once been her closest friends backed away even further, their faces contorted in absolute disgust and pity. They were witnessing a total societal execution, and nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a bankrupt pariah. Beatrice did not care about her audience anymore. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive emerald designer gown dragging across the sticky, ruined floor. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. The sheer, suffocating panic radiating from her was palpable. "Sienna, you have to listen to me," Beatrice sobbed, her voice cracking painfully as she clasped her trembling hands together in a posture of desperate prayer. "You have to help me. I am begging you." The bridge loan was tied directly to the estate. I signed the final paperwork when you refused to co-sign. The bank demanded immediate collateral for the extension, and I gave them everything I gave them. Big Mama's house. I looked down at the woman who had tormented my entire existence. You wagered the only piece of true generational wealth this family possessed to fund a criminal. I stated, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "I thought the Vanguard deal was guaranteed." Beatrice wailed, tears streaming rapidly down her heavily powdered cheeks, leaving terrible dark streaks. Trent swore the audit was just a formality. He swore the $50 million would clear by Friday. I was just trying to protect our family prestige. But the bank called me yesterday afternoon. The executives at First Atlanta flagged the mortgage transfer. They know Trent's startup is defaulting. They initiated the foreclosure process immediately. Beatrice reached out, her hands shaking violently, stopping just short of touching the hem of my wine-stained dress. She knew Julian would likely have his security team physically remove her if she dared to make physical contact, so she kept her hands hovering in the air, trembling with pathetic desperation. "Tomorrow morning, Sienna," Beatrice cried out, her voice echoing with raw, unfiltered terror. "At 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the bank is going to execute the foreclosure. They are going to send the marshals. They are going to seize the estate. They are going to lock the heavy iron gates and throw me out. I will lose everything. I will have absolutely nothing left. I will be homeless on the streets of Atlanta." She paused, gasping for air, choking on her own bitter tears, looking up at Julian, and then back to me. "You are a multimillionaire," she pleaded, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You own a massive crisis management firm. You own luxury skyscrapers. Julian is a billionaire. You have more money than God. Please, Sienna. I am your mother. I gave you life. I brought you into this world. I am begging you for mercy." She pressed her hands to her chest, trying to invoke a maternal bond that had never truly existed. "Just give me enough money to pay off the bank, pay off the toxic debt, and buy back the legacy estate. It's pocket change to you. You cannot let our ancestors' home fall into the hands of some ruthless bank. You cannot let your own mother end up living in a homeless shelter. Please, Sienna, save the house, save me." I stared down at the pathetic, weeping woman kneeling at my feet. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity, a single shred of daughterly affection. I looked for the scared little girl inside me who used to cry when her mother ignored her on her birthday. I found absolutely nothing but an endless, echoing void. She did not care about our ancestors' legacy. She only cared about maintaining the physical fortress that housed her arrogant ego. She had gladly risked our history to pamper a golden child and impress a circle of fake friends, and now she wanted me to bail her out. "You did not care about me when you threw me out of that exact same house on Christmas." I reminded her, my voice slicing through her hysterical, echoing sobbing with the surgical precision of a scalpel. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute freezing conviction behind my words made Beatrice flinch, as if she had been struck. You did not care about my financial well-being when you stormed into my penthouse and demanded I bankrupt myself to save your fraudulent son-in-law. You did not care about my dignity when you stood in this very ballroom just 30 minutes ago and loudly announced to your wealthy friends that I was a delusional psychiatric patient. You have spent 35 years prioritizing a lie over your own daughter. Beatrice shook her head frantically, her expensive diamond earrings rattling against her neck. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong, Sienna. I was just blinded by the stress. I am so sorry. I will do whatever you want. I will publicly apologize to you right now in front of everyone in this room. Just please write the check. Save the house. Save me. You are not sorry for how you treated me, Mother, I replied, my tone dropping to a cold, lethal whisper that paralyzed her entirely. You are only sorry that the check bounced. You are only sorry that the Buckhead elite just watched your golden son-in-law get dragged away in handcuffs by armed federal agents. You do not regret a single vicious, hateful thing you did to me. You only regret that I am the one holding all the cards today. I slowly unclasped my emerald green designer clutch. I reached inside my fingers, bypassing my phone and my lipstick, and pulled out a thick, heavy legal envelope. The thick parchment paper was sealed with an official embossed stamp. I held it in my hand for a moment, letting the sheer weight of the document anchor me. This was the culmination of everything. This was the final definitive checkmate. I looked down at my weeping mother and my trembling sister, and I simply opened my fingers. The heavy envelope dropped through the air. It landed squarely at Beatrice's knees, striking the marble floor with a soft, authoritative thud. Beatrice stared at the envelope, her tear-soaked eyes wide with confusion. She reached out with shaking, hesitant fingers, as if the paper might suddenly catch fire. She slowly pulled the thick stack of documents from the envelope. Her eyes scanned the bold legal headers, desperately trying to comprehend the complex financial terminology printed on the first page. The bank is not foreclosing on anything tomorrow morning, Mother, I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the silent ballroom, ensuring every single guest heard the absolute finality of my decree. Beatrice froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at me, her hands trembling violently as they gripped the papers. First Atlanta Bank no longer holds the mortgage on Big Mama's historic estate. I continued, savoring every single syllable. When you told me 2 weeks ago that you had leveraged the house, I immediately called my private wealth management firm. I instructed my legal team to aggressively approach the executives at First Atlanta. I offered to buy out their entire portfolio of toxic high-risk debt in Buckhead at a premium cash rate. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The deal cleared last week. The transfer of the deed was officially finalized this morning at 8 o'clock. Beatrice's mouth fell open. She looked down at the paper in her hands, finally recognizing the official transfer of deed, the notarized signatures, and my name printed clearly on the ownership line. As of this morning, I announced the absolute authority in my voice, leaving zero room for interpretation. I am the sole legal and uncontested owner of Big Mama's house. For a split second, a profound delusional glimmer of hopeful relief washed over Beatrice's ruined face. The sheer suffocating panic that had gripped her chest suddenly vanished, replaced by the familiar narcissistic assumption that the universe would always ultimately bend to serve her needs. She actually believed I had swooped in to rescue her. She believed that because I owned the debt, the threat of homelessness was instantly neutralized. "Oh, Sienna!" Beatrice gasped, letting out a wet, hysterical laugh of profound relief. She clutched the deed to her chest, tears of joy mixing with her ruined makeup. "Oh, thank God you bought the house. You saved it from the ruthless bank. You saved our beautiful home. I knew you wouldn't let our legacy die. We can go back right now. Kiara and I can pack up Trent's things and throw them away. We can pretend none of this terrible nightmare ever happened. You and Julian can come over for Sunday dinners. We can be a real family again. I swear I will make up for everything." I stared down at her, genuinely, profoundly amazed by the sheer staggering depth of her ongoing delusion. She actually believed she could abuse me for 3 entire decades, steal my college fund, humiliate me publicly, and then simply move back into my luxury property to comfortably resume her elite lifestyle as if nothing had ever happened. You misunderstand the situation completely, Mother, I said softly, my voice devoid of any warmth. Beatrice's hysterical laugh died instantly in her throat. The glimmer of hopeful relief in her eyes flickered and violently extinguished, replaced by a new creeping wave of absolute, unadulterated terror. Her hands, still clutching the deed to her chest, began to shake again. What? What exactly do you mean, Sienna? Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling, suddenly realizing she was standing on the edge of a sheer cliff. I mean that I did not buy Big Mama's historic house to save it for you, I stated flatly, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or misunderstanding. I bought it to save it from you, permanently. I stepped back, ensuring the hem of my ruined silk dress remained entirely out of her desperate reach. I am not letting you live there ever again, I announced. I am sending a commercial demolition crew to the property early on Monday morning. We are completely gutting the entire interior. I am tearing out the custom Italian marble kitchen you bought with my stolen tuition money. I am ripping out the imported hardwood floors Trent paced on while planning his massive wire fraud. The estate is being entirely systematically repurposed for something vastly more important than your pathetic, fraudulent social climbing. I looked back and forth between my kneeling mother and my weeping sister. They looked like two hollow shells completely drained of the arrogance that had sustained them for decades. I am transforming Big Mama's historic estate into a fully funded business incubator for young Black female entrepreneurs. I declared, my voice ringing with undeniable pride. I am turning it into a safe, empowering, highly capitalized haven for brilliant, hardworking women who actually work for their dreams instead of stealing them from their own bloodline. I will ensure Big Mama's legacy builds up our community instead of financing a fraudulent white-collar criminal. The generational wealth you tried to throw away will now fund the next generation of actual visionaries. Kiara gasped loudly, scrambling up from the floor to kneel directly beside our mother, her eyes wide with shock. You cannot do that to us. That is our home. That is where we grew up. You cannot just give our sacred family legacy away to a bunch of random strangers. They are not strangers, I countered immediately, my eyes flashing with absolute unyielding authority. They are the future, and they are infinitely more deserving of my financial investment than a vicious sister who slapped me in my own building and a greedy mother who mortgaged our rich history to fund a criminal scam. You permanently lost the right to call that place your home the exact second you eagerly signed the deed over to a predatory lender just to protect a fragile, arrogant man. Beatrice clutched her chest tightly, her breathing becoming dangerously erratic as the harsh, inescapable reality of her consequences finally fully set in. She was not just losing a house, she was losing her kingdom. Sienna, you cannot be serious about this, Beatrice wailed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. You are my own flesh and blood. You are going to throw your own mother out onto the freezing street after everything I sacrificed to keep that roof over our heads. You sacrificed me, I corrected her coldly, refusing to let her rewrite history. And yes, I am completely, entirely serious. You and Kiara have exactly 12 hours to pack your trash and vacate my property. The collective gasp from the remaining crowd was audible. A 12-hour eviction notice for a sprawling Buckhead estate was a logistical nightmare, a brutal, punishing sentence. 12 hours! Kiara shrieked, her voice pitching so high it nearly cracked glass. Are you absolutely insane? We have a massive 10-bedroom house full of heavy antique furniture, designer clothes, and expensive valuables. We cannot possibly pack everything in 12 short hours, and we do not have a moving truck. We do not even have access to Trent's bank accounts to hire anyone to help us move. Then you better start grabbing some heavy-duty garbage bags and putting in some serious physical labor, I suggested, smoothly adjusting Julian's warm, expensive jacket around my shoulders. Consider it a mandatory character-building exercise. I always hear that hard, honest manual work builds necessary humility. My private security team will arrive at the estate at precisely 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to change all the locks, activate the alarm system, and secure the perimeter. If either of you is still inside the house when my team arrives, you will be arrested and immediately charged with criminal trespassing. Beatrice grabbed the hem of my ruined dress again, her practiced composure entirely permanently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "Where are we supposed to go?" Beatrice sobbed, her voice echoing with the devastating, crushing realization that I was not bluffing. Her reign was officially over. "We have absolutely no money left. Sienna Trent's accounts are frozen indefinitely by the federal government. My credit cards are completely maxed out. Where am I supposed to live? Where am I supposed to sleep tomorrow night?" I looked down at her, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure wash over my tired soul. I had waited 35 years to finally reclaim my absolute power to sever the invisible chains of their abuse, and the magnificent moment was infinitely more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. "You should probably ask your highly successful white tech bro son-in-law for a place to stay," I replied, letting a sharp, triumphant smile touch my lips. "Oh, wait. He is currently sitting in a federal lockup, wearing heavy handcuffs, and nervously awaiting a decade-long prison sentence." Exactly 1 month had passed since the spectacular, catastrophic collapse of my former family's fraudulent empire. I stood on the expansive glass-paneled balcony of our stunning Manhattan penthouse, the crisp, biting morning wind sweeping off the Hudson River and wrapping around me. The sprawling, iconic skyline of New York City stretched out endlessly before me, a gorgeous, towering landscape of steel and glass that perfectly mirrored the impenetrable boundaries I had finally successfully constructed around my own life. I took a slow, savoring sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the rich, bitter warmth settle deep into my chest. The suffocating, toxic atmosphere of Atlanta, the constant buzzing anxiety of Beatrice's judgments, the shrill entitlement of Kiara's voice, the arrogant posturing of Trent felt like a distant, fading nightmare. It was a life that belonged to a completely different woman in a completely different universe. Resting my forearms against the freezing metal railing, I looked down at my smartphone resting on the glass table. The OLED screen was heavily cluttered with dozens of desperate, frantic notifications. They were a glowing digital monument to the total devastation Beatrice and Kiara had brought upon themselves. For 30 days, my phone had been blowing up with an endless barrage of missed calls, massive text paragraphs, and pathetic voicemails. I had not answered a single one. I tapped the screen, opening the message thread from Kiara. "According to my private security team's latest background report, my once arrogant, designer-clad sister was currently living a waking nightmare. Because Trent had been formally denied bail by a federal judge deemed a severe flight risk due to his offshore accounts, Kiara was entirely on her own. Without access to his frozen assets, she was currently working grueling back-to-back double shifts as a cocktail waitress at a loud, high-volume, mid-tier chain restaurant on the absolute outskirts of the city. I pictured her in a cheap, stiff polyester uniform, her feet blistered and aching, serving greasy appetizers and cheap beer to the very same working-class people she used to aggressively mock. She was desperately attempting to scrape together enough crumpled cash tips to pay the exorbitant mounting retainer fees for Trent's federal defense attorney. Her text messages were a chaotic, wildly swinging pendulum of furious entitlement and pathetic begging. "How could you do this to us? You are a monster. You ruined my life." One message read, sent at 2 a.m. Directly beneath it, sent just 3 hours later. "Please, Sienna, my feet are bleeding. I can't pay my rent this week. Please just wire me $5,000. I'm your sister." Directly beneath Kiara's messages sat a long, pathetic string of emotional, rambling voicemails from Beatrice. The former matriarch of Buckhead High Society, the woman who once looked down on anyone who didn't possess a country club membership, was now permanently residing in a run-down budget roadside motel located right next to a noisy, heavily trafficked interstate highway. My commercial demolition crew had moved into Big Mama's historic estate exactly 12 hours after the New Year's Eve gala, changing the locks, activating a state-of-the-art security grid, and barring Beatrice from ever stepping foot onto the property again. Her voicemails documented a rapid, humiliating psychological descent. First, she left messages aggressively demanding I buy her a luxury condo downtown to maintain her dignity. A week later, she was pleading for a modest townhouse in the suburbs. Now her latest messages consisted of her sobbing hysterically into the receiver, begging for a few $100s to cover her weekly grocery bills and her cheap motel rent. I stood on the balcony looking out over the city that never slept and listened to the cold, quiet truth of my own heart. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel a shred of sorrow, nor did I feel the heavy, misplaced burden of filial obligation that had weighed me down for 35 years. They were not crying because they regretted 3 decades of unrelenting emotional abuse. They were not sorry for stealing my college fund or for publicly humiliating me or for throwing a glass of wine at my chest. They were only crying because they no longer had access to my bank accounts to fund their unearned toxic arrogance. I did not owe them my peace. I did not owe them salvation. I reached out with a steady, perfectly manicured finger and pressed the red deletion icon. I watched the entire history of their desperate manipulative pleading vanish from my device in a fraction of a second. Next, I opened my contact settings, selected both of their phone numbers, and firmly pressed the button labeled block. The final microscopic digital thread tying me to my toxic bloodline was permanently severed. They were erased from my reality. The heavy soundproof sliding glass door of the balcony hissed open behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who had just stepped out into the crisp morning air. The familiar, deeply comforting scent of expensive cedar and crisp bergamot surrounded me a second before Julian wrapped his strong, muscular arms securely around my waist. He pulled my back flush against his broad chest, his imposing physical presence radiating an absolute, unshakable safety. He rested his chin gently upon my shoulder, his dark eyes following my gaze, out toward the towering, majestic skyscrapers of the financial district. We stood together, in perfect synchronized silence, two architects of corporate destruction who had successfully eradicated a profound parasitic evil from our personal lives. The final wire transfers cleared this morning. Julian murmured, his deep, resonant voice vibrating warmly against my skin, sending a pleasant shiver down my spine. The endowment is fully funded and legally protected in perpetuity from any outside interference. Your mother's former creditors have been completely bought out and permanently silenced. The estate is secure. I smiled, leaning the weight of my head back against him, closing my eyes for a brief moment to just exist in the absolute perfection of the moment. He reached over my shoulder, holding 2 crystal champagne flutes filled with vintage sparkling cider. He handed one of the elegant glasses to me. "To the grand opening," Julian said softly, clinking his heavy crystal flute gently against mine. The glass produced a bright, clear, beautiful chime that rang out over the distant, muffled sounds of the city traffic far below us. I raised my glass toward the morning sun. Today marked the official, highly anticipated launch of the Big Mama Foundation. The demolition crews had successfully and aggressively gutted the toxic, ostentatious interior of the Atlanta estate, stripping away every single trace of Beatrice's greedy, superficial existence. The gaudy chandeliers were gone. The imported Italian marble that Trent used to pace on was ripped out. In its place, my construction teams had built a state-of-the-art, fully modernized business incubator. We had installed high-tech conference rooms, ultra-high-speed server networks, and collaborative, inspiring workspaces. Today, our very first cohort of 50 young, brilliant Black female entrepreneurs was moving into the facility. They were receiving full seed funding, comprehensive legal support, and direct hands-on mentorship from my crisis management firm to build their own legitimate, powerful empires. I had taken the sacred, hard-earned generational wealth that Beatrice had selfishly, recklessly gambled away on a white-collar criminal, and I had transformed it into a powerful, unstoppable engine for my community. I was ensuring that the profound legacy of our ancestors would be used to build women up, rather than being exploited by a narcissistic mother to tear a scapegoated daughter down. I took a slow sip of my drink, the sweet, crisp liquid perfectly matching the triumphant, soaring victory singing in my veins. Trent was sitting in a federal penitentiary, awaiting a decade behind bars, his reputation permanently destroyed. Kiara was scrubbing sticky tables and serving cheap beer to survive entirely stripped of the unearned privilege she had wielded like a weapon. Beatrice was permanently exiled to a roadside motel with absolutely no audience left to manipulate and no wealth left to flaunt. They had relentlessly tried to break my spirit for 35 years. They had tried to keep me small, lonely, and silent so they could feel large, successful, and loud. They had failed catastrophically. I turned around in Julian's secure embrace, wrapping my arms tightly around his neck, and kissed him deeply. I pulled back and looked into the dark, loving eyes of the man who had stood beside me, unyielding and protective, while I burned my abuser's fraudulent kingdom to the ground. I felt absolute profound peace settle permanently into my bones. I possessed an unbreakable, thriving career, a fiercely loyal billionaire partner, and a sacred legacy that could never, ever be stolen again. I finally understood the deepest truth of the universe. The ultimate, most devastating revenge is not screaming or arguing or stooping to their level. The greatest revenge is simply unbothered generational success, completely and permanently severed from a toxic family.